Hello and welcome to our Week 6 supplemental lecture on Hannah Arendt's Ideology and Terror, a Novel Form of Government. This is a short and densely packed chapter in a much longer book, so we're just getting a fragment of an argument here. We want to take a look at Arendt's work because she's one of the first people to theorize a concept of totalitarianism. There are some analytic traditions that would see governmental forms like National Socialism and Stalinist communism as antithetical to each other and as quite different phenomenon. Arendt is one of the earlier theorists to say, look, there's a significant respect in which these forms of government, although different in many ways, can be seen as the same thing, as a totalitarian form of government. And in this work she's unpacking what are the characteristics of totalitarianism and how does it relate to 19th century ideologies and to the use of terror as a tool of social control. She says there's a tendency in political theory to not want to treat totalitarianism as its own distinct thing. It tends to get collapsed into other authoritarian forms like despotism or dictatorship or tyranny. There's a reluctance to grant it its own status as something historically distinct. But she suggests that it does need to be considered as its own novel governmental form. And it has certain characteristics that other forms of authoritarian government don't have. Among them that it destroys social, legal, and political traditions. It transforms, she says, classes into masses, and conceptualizes itself and functions as a mass movement rather than as a party system, even if it begins from a party system. It's characterized by a shift in power from the army to the police, and it has a foreign policy that is expansionist and aimed at global domination. She says this is not some strange contingent thing that's accidentally happened because you have these two madmen in power. It's not going to go away just because Stalin or Hitler goes away. It is something that must have a basis in some aspect of our time, and it's important for us to understand what that basis is because it's going to stay with us as long as that basis does. So she says, what's its nature? And again, there's a tendency that she's reacting to in the literature of her time to deny that it has a nature, to see it as a sort of an accidental byproduct of the failure of liberalism and democracy. Something goes wrong and you get a new form of oppression that's just hodgepodge borrowing the tools of other despotic forms of power. She doesn't think that this is an adequate conception of what's going on. And she wants to ask, what is its nature? What kind of nature does it have? She's not going to fully answer this question until toward the end of the chapter, but she poses the problem at the outset. She says, if this is true, then the entirely new and unprecedented forms of totalitarian organization and course of action must rest on a few basic experiences which men can have whenever they live together and are concerned with public affairs. If there is a basic experience which finds its political expression in totalitarian domination, then in view of the novelty of the totalitarian form of government, this must be an experience which, for whatever reason, has never before served as the foundation of a body politic, and whose general mood, although it may be familiar in every other respect, never before has pervaded and directed the handling of public affairs. So her argument is that we've had a set of basic political forms that were identified quite early. She thinks that classical Greek antiquity was already basically familiar with all of the forms that we've seen between then and now, except for totalitarianism. And there is a basis, a sort of communal basis, a material basis, on which other forms of governments tend to rely and depend, and they arise in periods where particular bases for government are dominant. It is unclear what the basis would be for totalitarianism. What sort of human need is it serving? And she wants to try to unpack that in the course of this chapter. She says there's a tendency to see it as a lawless form of government, and this seems to be justified because it comes in and it abrogates the law. It declares a state of exception. This is a concept we'll see in other readings this term, and it abolishes traditional forms of authority and holds itself out to be above the law. And this is similar in some ways to the way that tyranny is theorized and conceptualized, the difference being that totalitarianism is not disorderly. Arendt thinks, in the way that tyranny is. It shouldn't be considered lawless or arbitrary in its exercise of power. It does attack previous laws, but it's putting something in their place that is different from lawlessness. It is different from the arbitrary assertion of the individual will of the ruler. There's something more complicated going on. And she says you need to pay attention to what it says about itself. It claims to obey strictly and unequivocally those laws of nature or of history from which all positive laws have always been supposed to spring. So nature, she has in mind National Socialism, the idea that nature is a struggle between races, and history, she has the idea of Stalinist communism, the idea that history is the history of class struggle. So there are these two notions of what is going on, what is fundamental in history, and these movements both claim to be obeying these historical laws, even if they are very violent toward human laws. And she says it's not new to assert that the lawfulness of a regime comes somehow from laws of nature. What's new is how those laws of nature and history are understood. She said, it is the monstrous yet seemingly unanswerable claim of totalitarian rule that far from being lawless, it goes to the sources of authority from which positive laws received their ultimate legitimation. That far from being arbitrary, it is more obedient to these superhuman forces than any government ever was before. And that far from wielding its power in the interest of one man, it is quite prepared to sacrifice everybody's vital immediate interests to the execution of what it assumes to be the law of history or the law of nature. Its defiance of positive laws, that is, laws enacted by the state, claims to be a higher form of legitimacy, which, since it is inspired by the sources themselves, can do away with petty legality. So mere human laws arising from mere positive acts of government are inadequate. There are objective laws enshrined and inscribed in history and in nature, and these regimes claim to be following those laws, and then can abrogate mere human convention as a result. She says totalitarian lawfulness, defying legality, distinction between lawfulness and legality, and pretending to establish the direct reign of justice on earth, executes the law of history or of nature without translating it into standards of right and wrong for individual behavior. It applies the law directly to mankind, without bothering with the behavior of men. The law of nature or the law of history, if executed properly, is expected to produce mankind as its end product. And this expectation lies behind the claim to global rule of all totalitarian governments. Totalitarian policy claims to transform the human species into an active, unfailing carrier of a law to which human beings otherwise would be only passively and reluctantly subjected. So there's a distinction in how totalitarianism represents itself in its own lawfulness. It is not trying to legislate in conformity with some vision of natural laws. It is trying itself to be a force of nature or a force of history, and it is going to produce the new humanity, the new man. And this is a novel political and historical goal, this idea that you can come up with this absolute break from previous human societies, and that you can do it aligned with a developmental process of history or nature, and that by siding with that developmental process and by making humanity conform to the requirements of that developmental process, you will end up with a new humanity which claims to bring about justice of some kind. So she thinks that this is not something that we can easily characterize as lawless, but the relationship to lawfulness is very, very different than in any other prior governmental form. And she says one of the things that this particular conception of lawfulness relies on is a shift in what law is and what it means, a shift such that laws become laws of motion, of movement. And this, for Arendt, inverts what would have previously been the case. So previously she talks about a conception of law where you have a flux of chaotic human activity, and the law is your point of stability. It is the still point that tries to regulate sort of human chaos. That's shifted in totalitarian governments. There is law as a constant, dynamic, linear, progressive motion. She says this breaks with the notion of consent as the basis for legitimate authority, which she thinks is quite an old notion. In place of consent, she says, it promises justice on earth because it claims to make mankind itself the embodiment of the law. So humans will conform to these historical or natural processes. They will be reshaped and become new sorts of creatures who are the living embodiments of the law. So you no longer have a distinction between humans and their behavior and then the laws that govern them. Human behavior is going to become the instantiation and the embodiment of the motion of the law itself. So it does away with what she calls the gap between legality and justice, that other governmental forms fall short of reaching justice because all they can do is pass positive laws, and human behavior only ever imperfectly approximates those laws. So there's a gap between the transient movements of people and the relative stability that's provided by the law. She says, in the interpretation of totalitarianism, all laws have become laws of movement. When the Nazis talked about the law of nature, or when the Bolsheviks talk about the law of history, neither nature nor history is any longer the stabilizing source of authority for the actions of mortal men. They are movements in themselves. Okay, so earlier notions of natural law assume that it is somehow transcendent to society, that it is more timeless, and therefore it can provide a stable foundation for human laws and to regulate human actions that are understood as more ephemeral. These totalitarian forms place the law itself in motion, and then you need to have totalitarianism itself understood in terms of a movement where humans are going to be reshaped and formed, and in their motion are going to act out laws of nature or history. She talks about Darwin and Marx here. It's a brief section and it's a bit problematic in the sense that it's probably not accurate to either Darwin or Marx, although it is certainly accurate to a way that both of these figures have been appropriated and are sometimes misunderstood. She says that their work with reference to both nature and history mark a shift to the notion of natural movement that is not a cyclical or circular movement, but what Arendt describes as unilinear, moving in an infinitely progressing direction. Okay, so you've got a notion of infinite progress, and again, I don't think that's actually quite accurate to either Darwin or Marx. With both of them you have, I think in reality, a notion that whatever we have in the present is formed out of or descends from things in the past, but that's a little bit different from the argument that what comes later is progress in the sense of an advance over what came before. But it's certainly a way that the two are sometimes appropriated, and it's probably the vision of them that feeds into these movements that Arendt is concerned with. And she says when you have this notion of infinite progress that is law-like, that has a law of motion governing it, you blur the distinction between nature and history. Okay, so nature gets a history, it gets a history of progress, and history is governed by quasi-natural laws. It's driven and expresses a law-like character that we associate with the natural world. She says the tremendous intellectual change which took place in the middle of the last century consisted in the refusal to view or accept anything as it is, and in the consistent interpretation of everything as being only a stage of some further development. Okay, so everything is sort of unmoored and placed in a chain of history, in a chain of events. Think about the way that Weber talked about science and the activity of the scientists. This is a big intellectual shift, and it gobbles up a lot of people. It's not just got people who are involved with one of these large ideologies. It is a general cultural shift that happens at the time. She says, in these ideologies, the term law itself changed its meaning. From expressing the framework of stability within which human actions and motions can take place, it became the expression of the motion itself. And there's a concept of infinite movement that she thinks is built in to these totalitarian articulations of these ideologies, such that if you stop the movement, if the law culminates or ceases to operate, this would mean the end of history or the end of nature. That intrinsically the laws of motion to which these movements appeal are laws that you can't see going away. Now again, this is a possibly contended point. There are sometimes notions of a telos or an end point or an objective to which the laws are driving, but certainly there's a plasticity in the laws of motion. There's a restlessness to the drive that they describe. And then she talks about terror and the function of terror. She says that totalitarian governmental forms replace positive laws with terror. She says just as positive laws, though they define transgressions, are independent of them, the absence of crimes in any society does not render laws superfluous, but on the contrary signifies their most perfect rule. Okay, so if you've got a set of laws and you're not catching anyone violating them, that doesn't mean the laws are nonsense. It is an indication that the society is operating in total conformity with those laws. So that's in a regime of positive law. With terror, there's something similar going on. So terror in totalitarian government has ceased to be a mere means for the suppression of opposition, though it is also used for such purposes. So like laws in a non-totalitarian society regulate crime, and if you violate them, the laws can have effect. In a terroristic society, you can use the terror to suppress opposition. But in both cases, there's something going on that is of independent value, even if there's no criminality, even if there's no opposition to suppress. She says terror becomes total when it becomes independent of all opposition. It rules supreme when nobody any longer stands in its way. If lawfulness is the essence of non-tyrannical government, and lawlessness is the essence of tyranny, then terror is the essence of totalitarian domination. And again, one of the things she has in mind here is the aggressive pursuit of, persecution of, murder of people that in fact pose no threat, and in some cases people who at one point or another were in fact in the inner circle of the regime actively promoting what it does. Okay, so the terror is used against groups of people that can't plausibly or objectively be seen as threatening the existence of the regime. So the terror must be doing something else other than stamping down on opposition. She says terror is the realization of the law of movement. Its chief aim is to make it possible for the force of nature or of history to race freely through mankind, unhindered by spontaneous human action. As such, terror seeks to stabilize men in order to liberate the forces of nature or history. So it's the inversion of how she thinks law used to operate, where you had men who were in motion, in flux, and law was the stable point. Now we're going to stabilize the people, and then the forces of history or nature are going to flow through them. Okay, so you make sure that nothing idiosyncratic about human behavior is going to get in the way of the free movement of whatever you think the law is. She says guilt or innocence are no longer meaningful because everything is a cipher of this sort of higher movement of history or nature. Individuals are meant to carry out that movement, and definitionally, if the movement wants the elimination of those particular individuals, they need to be eliminated. And that's independent of guilt or innocence in the way that those might exist in the framework of positive law. She says terror as the execution of a law of movement whose ultimate goal is not the welfare of men or the interest of one man, but the fabrication of mankind. Eliminates individuals for the sake of the species, sacrifices the parts for the sake of the whole. The superhuman force of nature or history has its own beginning and its own end, so that it can be hindered only by the new beginning and individual ends which the life of each man actually is. Okay, so people are potentially in the way, or you can recast people so that they are nothing more than the movement of history or nature. They're nothing more than the embodiments of this flowing progressive law. But along the way, you eliminate groups of people in accordance with the way that you interpret the law, and this isn't really related to whether they're going to pose any practical problem for the regime itself. So when totalitarian regimes come into play, they look like tyranny at first. They dismantle and abolish laws. But what distinguishes them from tyranny for Arendt is that this is not in the service of some kind of arbitrary individual will, and it doesn't leave lawlessness behind. She says it substitutes for the boundaries and channels of communication between individual men a band of iron, which holds them so tightly together that it is as though their plurality had disappeared into one man of gigantic proportion. So it tries to achieve an intense regulation of individual behavior so that everyone is functioning as part of this undifferentiated mass. It eliminates a space between people that she says still continues to exist in tyranny, and is one of the reasons that tyranny is so unstable and so often overthrown from within. It leaves people no room to move. And it understands human freedom, individual actions that are driven by individual self-determination, as slowing down the flow of nature or history. So if you eliminate human freedom, you are freeing up natural and historical forces to act as they would without human interference. There's some interesting parallels here to the idea of humans getting out of the way of something like the market, but we're operating in a different sphere here, in a political sphere. We're understanding that the forces to be freed up are these juggernaut historical laws, and people need to be tightly controlled to make sure those laws can run their course. And it's something that can't be fully realized without global domination. Until you've got every person wrapped up in this iron band, something's going to be hindering the laws of nature or history. She says it leaves no guiding principle for human behavior because it doesn't want people making decisions about how to behave. There's fear. People are very afraid, the fear is ubiquitous, but it's not useful as a motivator for action since it's sort of random whether the terror is going to target you, whether it's going to ask you to exterminate someone else, whether it's going to turn on you in turn. She says terror will choose victims according to objective standards. It chooses its executioners with as complete disregard for the candidate's conviction and sympathies. And she talks about the fact, and this is something that is evident particularly in Stalinist communism, but that you can have people flipping back and forth between being executioners and victims from one moment to the next as the interpretation of the requirements of the historical or natural law change. The roles can reverse. But in any case, the people being targeted are not people who have merited it somehow. It's not that if only they could have understood the principles of how to behave, they could have avoided being asked either to be an executioner or to be a victim. It's not operating at that level. So while there is universalized fear, the fear is not in fact useful for driving action. Law has been eliminated as a way of driving action, and everything is bound into this complete regulation of people, the elimination of decisions about behaviors, so that these juggernaut of historical or natural laws can run their force. And then she says, so what's the relationship of all of this to ideologies? Do ideologies cause totalitarianism? What's the relationship? And she says the ideologies are the various isms that we know about, and that they're all historically quite recent, and essentially doesn't have a huge impact until they get picked up and channeled by Hitler and Stalin, who, she says, revealed their potential. So it's not going to be her argument that the ideologies are basically innately harmless and a couple of people distorted them and did ugly things with them. She thinks that Hitler and Stalin actually revealed what were latent totalitarian impulses in ideologies all along. What is arbitrary is the specific ideologies that Hitler and Stalin decided to pick up and develop into their full totalitarian potential. And the fact that that was possible with some ideologies rather than others has to do with the sort of political appeal of those ideologies in particular circumstances. She says the term ideology implies we've got something to do with science here, that it has to do with a set of scientific statements that people believe. But there's actually more to the concept of ideology than this. That doesn't capture its essence. She says an ideology is the logic of an idea. Its subject matter is history, to which the idea is applied. The result of this application is not a body of statements about something that is, but the unfolding of a process which is in constant change. The ideology treats the course of events as though it followed the same law as the logical exposition of its idea. Ideologies pretend to know the mysteries of the whole historical process, the secrets of the past, the intricacies of the present, the uncertainties of the future, because of the logic inherent in their respective ideas. So an ideology for Arendt is something that has a notion that you've got a basic foundational concept, and this concept is transhistorically valid as a description of a historical movement, as a pattern of historical change. And from the logical implications of the idea, ideologies claim to be able to roll out the actual direction of history. She says ideologies are never interested in the miracle of being. They are historical, concerned with becoming and perishing, with the rise and fall of cultures, even if they try to explain history by some law of nature. The word race in racism does not signify any genuine curiosity about the human races as a field for scientific exploration, but is the idea by which the movement of history is explained as one consistent process. So racism for Arendt is an ideology that believes that you've always got racial struggle and that that is a motor of history. Stalinism, she thinks, is driven by the idea that you've always got class struggle as a motor of history. So it's simple, it has a logical progression, or can be argued to have a logical progression embedded within it, and by unfolding the logic of the idea, you can claim to be predicting the course that history is going to run. She says the logic of motion that's implicit in a single idea, a simple kind of framework, suggests that the course of history can be calculated. It doesn't need anything else for us to understand what's going on, but to unfold deductions from premises. And she says there's nothing intrinsically totalitarian about the wide range of 19th century ideologies. Racist and communist ideologies that get taken up in the 20th century in totalitarian forms are not more totalitarian than other ideologies that arise in the 19th century. They're just politically more relevant. They moved more people. But she says on the flip side, all ideologies contain totalitarian elements, but these are fully developed only by totalitarian movements, and this creates the deceptive impression that only racism and communism are totalitarian in character. The truth is rather that the real nature of all ideologies was revealed only in the role that the ideology plays in the apparatus of totalitarian domination. Okay, so it's a bold claim here. Other ideologies that have not yet taken totalitarian form might in fact be able to do so in the future. There's nothing intrinsic about the couple that actually do take this form that leads us to think that those are more dangerous than other ideologies, or that they're particularly dangerous as ideologies. What she thinks that National Socialism and Stalinist communism show are three specifically totalitarian elements peculiar to all ideological thinking. Okay, so these are the elements capable of being exploited by forms of totalitarianism. She says the first is the tendency to explain not what is, but what becomes, what is born and passes away, in all cases concerned solely with the element of motion, that is, with history. So this idea that you have a simple idea, it gives you a law of motion, that law of motion lets you see how things are trending, and you are focused on the direction things are meant to go, rather than on how they currently are. You are focused on remolding what is in the shape of what you think you know is to come. Second, she says, ideological thinking becomes independent of all experience, from which it cannot learn anything new, even if it is a question of something which has just come to pass. Ideological thinking becomes emancipated from the reality that we perceive with our five senses, and insists on a truer reality concealed behind all perceptible things, dominating them from this place of concealment and requiring a sixth sense that enables us to become aware of it. And she thinks the ideology then steps in as the sixth sense. So these are not empirically refutable things. If you think back to the Popper from a couple of weeks ago, this is sort of what he's complaining about in forms of thought that are more innocuous than the ones that she's examining here, or at least that are more innocuous in terms of their immediate manifestation. And if you think back to the readings from last week and how concerned some of the people are who are criticizing critical studies of science and technology, this is the kind of thing that they're worrying about. Whether they're aware of Arendt's argument or not, they're replicating elements of it. They're worried about forms of thought that seem to immunize themselves from the possibility of refutation. Okay, and Arendt thinks there's something in ideology that does that. It's always going to reinterpret any given empirical evidence that confronts it in the light of what the ideology says is meant to be the case. So everything's going to get interpreted away. There is, in Popper's terms, no falsifiable prediction being made. And the third element is that it orders facts into an absolutely logical procedure, which starts from an axiomatically accepted premise, deducing everything else from it. That is, it proceeds with a consistency that exists nowhere in the realm of reality. Because it thinks in terms of a process, is supposed to be able to comprehend the movement of superhuman, natural, or historical processes. Once it has established its premise, its point of departure, experiences no longer interfere with ideological thinking, nor can it be taught by reality. Okay, so it works on the basis of a logical deduction from simple a priori premises, and once these premises are accepted, you just keep unfolding the implications of them. And if history shifts in ways that suggest that in fact history is not going the way your ideology predicts it's going to go, you just say that it's being deformed by some human behavior, and you can get it back on track if you remold and recast humanity in the right way. Again, it's this idea that it is unfalsifiable, and it sticks strictly to an abstracted notion of the logic of historical movement, rather than looking at what's actually happening and the mess of things on the ground. And therefore it's sort of empirically unassailable, because it's not operating on an empirical plane, it's just logically deducing what's going to happen next. So what totalitarianism does with these tendencies within ideologies is it takes over the tendencies, and it pushes them past the point that the ideologies themselves would have taken themselves in a pre-totalitarian era. So it pushes them into a murderous set of logical deductions. She says, whoever agreed with the premise that nature or history was driving toward the elimination of certain people, but who then disagreed with just going ahead and directly killing those people, she says, was plainly either stupid or a coward. Okay, so the idea is you've got a notion of laws of history or nature. These laws have a progressive element. Certain societies, certain historical periods are better, are more advanced, are going to win out, and others are going to die away. Or certain races of people are at the apex, and others are going to die out and degenerate away. And once you've established this logic, once you've put things on that logical progressive continuum, what totalitarian forms do is to say, all right, if this is where history is trending, let's just eliminate the people now. And she says that it, for those who buy into the starting premise of the ideology, becomes very, very hard to refute, because that does seem to be the logical culmination of the laws of history that they're asserting, that they've committed to. She says totalitarianism is no longer primarily driven by the idea, but by the logical movement derivable from it. Its power is invested in the logical process. And totalitarian movements and parties no longer actually have to appeal to masses, even if in their origins there might have been some mass element to them. As soon as this happens, the totalitarian development of the ideology strips any gains that had been made on the basis of the ideology, and she talks about workers losing rights that they'd gained under the Tsar once the Bolsheviks come to power. She says it is the nature of ideological politics, and is not simply a betrayal committed for the sake of self-interest or lust for power, that the real content of the ideology, the working class or the Germanic peoples, which had originally brought about the idea, the struggle of classes as the law of history, or the struggle of races as the law of nature, is devoured by the logic with which the idea is carried out. This logical character, rather than the content of the ideologies, which she implies as sort of indifferent, is what the totalitarian forms of government need. The logic drives to extermination. The end point of a progressive process is that some forms are going to die away, and if you push that to extreme conclusions, you can drive the argument that they should be killed off, that they should be exterminated now. She says here the coercive force of logicality seems to have a source. It springs from our fear of contradicting ourselves. Okay, so it entraps people who buy the original premise of the ideology. They've bought into the premise, it's difficult to argue against the conclusion. She says totalitarian governments rely on self-compulsion to follow a logical chain to its end, removing the self from reality. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule, she says, is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. Okay, so if you get people severed from empirical refutation, if you get people not trusting that information their own senses can collect can refute ideas, you have people who can just be convinced by a logical chain of arguments. They don't have anything else to point to that is outside the basic ideology that they could use as a basis for judgment. And again, you heard echoes of this in the readings we did last week. This is why some people are very, very concerned with critiques of science, concerned with critiques that undermine confidence in the reality of experience or in the distinction between truth and falsity. It's one of the things that people are concerned about that is playing out in this argument here. So she said at the beginning of the chapter that if you get a form of government, it must be meeting some kind of human need. What sort of need could this possibly be meeting? It seems incredibly sacrificial. It seems incredibly disregarding of the needs of its population. She says, well, you have to look at social transformations in recent time. She says the isolation of people from one another is a precondition for totalitarianism. Isolation undermines political power, but it's required for all, she says, so-called productive activities of men. Okay, so political action for Arendt is something that we do together. It's something we do collectively. It's something we do in community. Production is something that we do privately. And these are distinctions that she develops in much greater detail elsewhere in her work. I won't go into depth on them here. But she draws a distinction between political action that you do in concert with other people, a kind of work that you do in isolation from political life, but that is still making an original contribution. So you are isolated in it, but there is something creative about the activity. And then just mere labor that you do in isolation, deprived of the capacity to make any kind of active or original contribution. She says that last binds isolation to loneliness. It removes political action and creative production, but it leaves basic productive capacity intact. Okay, now what she has in mind are some of the things that we talked about when we looked at classical social theories, and particularly theories of capitalism. This is her attempt to analyze the impact of the Industrial Revolution and the development of new forms of mass production, and the de-skilling of the labor process and the reduction of people to sort of just cogs in the machine who contribute their labor power but don't contribute anything of their creative capacity to the production process. She says totalitarianism is new in that it destroys not just public life, which tyranny also does, but also private life. It bases itself, she says, on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. And so this is something that she thinks is not a condition that exists on a widespread level in previous societies. It's not that it never exists, it's not that people are never isolated and never lonely, but there's a mass production in recent history of these qualities, and totalitarianism hinges on that. It depends on it. And then she talks more explicitly about industrial production. She says, loneliness, the common ground for terror, the essence of totalitarian government, and for ideology or logicality, the preparation of its executioners and victims, is closely connected with uprootedness and superfluousness, which have been the curse of modern masses since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and have become acute with the rise of imperialism at the end of the last century, and the breakdown of political institutions and social traditions in our own time. She says, to guide actions we need common sense, which we work out with other people. And if we're not able to do this, if we're not able to do these sort of common meaning-generating activities, we lose trust in our own sensory experience. And we lose the confidence in what we ourselves perceive because it can't be reflected in and reinforced and hashed out with other people. And loneliness and isolation result from that, and they undermine political activity and the possibility for meaningful freedom, and they insulate us from what our own senses are telling us. She says, what makes loneliness so unbearable is the loss of one's own self, which can be realized in solitude, but confirmed in its identity only by trusting and trustworthy company of my equals. In this situation, man loses trust in himself as the partner of his thoughts, and that elementary confidence in the world which is necessary to make experiences at all. Self and world, capacity for thought and experience, are lost at the same time. And so what's left, the only thing left, if trust in your sensory experiences, in your own intuitions around your sensory experiences is gone, what's left is this ruthless deductive logic. You can do that in isolation, she thinks. It doesn't require the support of other people. So a society whose social and economic institutions drive people into a particular kind of isolation and loneliness are making them particularly vulnerable to the kinds of logic that are necessary for totalitarian regimes. So she concludes, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. The merciless process into which totalitarianism drives and organizes the masses looks like a suicidal escape from this reality. The ice-cold reasoning and the mighty tentacle of dialectics which seizes you as in a vise appears like a last support in a world where nobody is reliable and nothing can be relied upon. It is the inner coercion, whose only content is strict avoidance of contraindications, that seem to confirm a man's identity outside all relationships with others. It fits him into the iron band of terror even when he is alone, and totalitarian domination tries never to leave him alone, except in the extreme situation of solitary confinement. By destroying all space between men, and pressing men against each other, even the productive potentialities of isolation are annihilated. By teaching and glorifying the logical reasoning of loneliness, where man knows that he will be utterly lost if ever he lets go of the first premise from which the whole process is being started, even the slim chances of that loneliness being transformed into solitude and logic into thought are obliterated. Okay. It can be interesting to revisit the Durkheim that we took a look at in week 3 in light of this, the idea that you can get social patterns of isolation that render people unmoored from their connections to other people, and that you get significant social dysfunction when this takes place, the concept of anomie in Durkheim's terms. So Arendt is suggesting here that we've got social processes that create on a mass scale forms of isolation that make people particularly vulnerable to totalitarian uses of ideology. She doesn't think the situation is hopeless. She thinks that totalitarianism, like tyranny, has the seeds of its own destruction within itself. But she is also not convinced that it is an option that's going to go away, that just bringing down Hitler and Stalin she doesn't think is sufficient for banishing totalitarianism, because it does in fact meet a particular historically specific human need.